Welcome back to the Science Podcast YouTube channel. We're diving deep today into the world of Pegasus spyware.
Ooh, Pegasus. It's pretty scary stuff.
You guys have sent us a ton of research on this, and we're ready to unpack it all. Government surveillance, zero-day exploits, and the potential for this tech to be used against, well, pretty much anyone.
Yeah, and the story starts with, believe it or not, a single text message.
This is back in 2016, right? To Ahmed Mansour, the human rights activist.
That's the one. He was in the UAE, and thankfully, he suspected something was fishy and contacted Citizen Lab.
Citizen Lab, they're the cybersecurity watchdog group, right?
Right. And that was a seriously smart move because it ended up blowing the whole thing wide open.
So how'd Citizen Lab even figure out what was going on? I mean, I can't imagine it was as easy as just reading the text.
No, not at all. They had to get a little creative. They used what's called a dummy iPhone as like a decoy to set a trap.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so they used what's called a man-in-the-middle attack to intercept the communication between the phone and the servers they thought were running Pegasus.
Wow, that sounds pretty complicated.
Yeah, it is. But the main thing is that Citizen Lab found something really, really troubling. They found that Pegasus was using these things called zero-day vulnerabilities to get into iPhones.
So like flaws that Apple, the company that actually makes the iPhone, didn't even know about.
Exactly.
So you're saying someone could break into my phone without me knowing just because of some hidden flaw?
That's the danger of zero-day exploits. That's what makes Pegasus so effective. It can silently turn on your microphone, camera, access messages, track your location, all without you ever knowing.
Okay, that's super unsettling. So who's behind this? Who made Pegasus?
A company called the NSO Group. It's an Israeli tech company, and they say they only sell Pegasus to governments, specifically for fighting terrorism and serious crime.
Okay, but who even gets to decide what counts as terrorism or serious crime? That seems like it could be a really slippery slope.
You're telling me, like, for example, get this. The Mexican government reportedly used Pegasus to target activists who are campaigning for a soda tax.
A soda tax?
Yeah.
To combat childhood obesity. I mean, that doesn't exactly sound like terrorism.
Nope. But they felt it justified using this powerful spyware against them.
This is where it starts to feel like something out of a dystopian movie, for sure. But it's not just activists being targeted. There are reports of journalists being targeted in Mexico, and tragically, some of them were killed after reporting on corruption.
Yeah, and then there's the case of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was murdered. His friends and family were reportedly targeted with Pegasus, too.
So this isn't just theoretical. This is really happening, and it's being used to silence people.
Right. These cases raise some really big ethical questions. How can we make sure that this technology isn't being used to silence dissent?
So what can we do? Is there anything we as individuals can do to protect ourselves?
Well, you can be more careful about what links you click on. Keep your devices updated with the latest software. Maybe think about limiting the number of apps you use.
Okay, so being careful about what we click on, keeping our software up to date, and maybe being more mindful about the apps we use. That sounds like good advice, but is that really enough?
It's a good start, but it might not be foolproof. Ultimately, the real solution is going to require more transparency and accountability from the companies that create these technologies and the governments that use them.
So it's about shining a light on this and pushing for some answers.
Exactly. We need to talk about the balance between security and privacy and where that line is in our digital age.
Okay, so we've talked about the abuse potential and the privacy implications, but I have to admit I'm still a bit curious about how it works. How does this spyware actually work? How do they get it onto your phone without you knowing?
Well, it all comes back to those zero-day exploits. Basically, the NSO Group is really, really good at finding these hidden vulnerabilities in software, those flaws that even the companies that made the software don't know about.
So it's almost like magic, breaking into your phone without even touching it.
Yeah, it's not magic, but it is complicated. It involves a lot of code manipulation, exploiting these flaws, and gaining control of the device without the user ever knowing.
So they find a weakness.
Yeah.
What next? How do they actually get the spyware on your phone?
One of the most common ways is through phishing attacks. Like, they might send a text message that looks totally legit, maybe from a delivery company or a bank, but it actually contains this hidden bit of code. And when your phone processes it, bam, they've got access.
Wow. So just clicking a link in a text message could compromise your entire phone.
That's right. That's why you have to be so careful about what you click on, especially if it's from someone you don't know.
And once they're in, what can they do?
Pretty much anything. They can turn on your microphone, camera, record your calls, read your text messages, steal your passwords. Basically, they have full control.
And all this happens without the user knowing. No warning signs, no pop-ups, nothing.
Exactly. That's what makes Pegasus so scary. It's completely invisible. You could be infected right now and have no idea.
Okay, that's a pretty terrifying thought.
Uh-huh.
But I'm assuming companies like Apple aren't just letting this happen. What are they doing about it?
Well, once they find out about a zero-day exploit, they work really fast to try and patch it up. They release software updates to protect users. That's why it's so important to keep your devices updated. Those annoying update notifications are actually there for a reason.
So those updates are really our first line of defense.
They're a big part of it, but it's a constant back and forth. The NSO Group is always searching for new vulnerabilities, buying them on the black market, and there are even rumors that they might be planting their own people inside these tech companies to introduce flaws on purpose.
It sounds like something out of a spy movie.
I know, right? But this is real life, and the stakes are high. We're talking about basic human rights here. The right to privacy and the potential for technology to be used as a tool of oppression.
So it's not just about the technology. It's about how it's being used and who it's being used against.
Yeah.
We've talked about the potential for abuse and the implications for our privacy, but I think it's important to come back to the ethical side of all this.
Absolutely.
This isn't just some technical wizardry. It's about the potential for this technology to be used for evil. And we've already seen some of that with cases like Jamal Khashoggi and Loujain al-Hathwal.
Yes, their stories are heartbreaking.
The Khashoggi case is especially disturbing. The idea that a government could use spyware to track a journalist's movements and then potentially use that information to have him assassinated is terrifying.
It shows how easily technology can be weaponized and raises really serious questions about the role of governments and tech companies in regulating these tools.
I mean, the NSO Group claims that they only sell Pegasus to governments for legitimate law enforcement purposes. But who gets to decide what's legitimate?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Unfortunately, there aren't any easy answers. But it's a conversation we need to be having.
We need to talk about the balance between security and privacy and the potential for these powerful technologies to be abused.
I completely agree. We need to ask tough questions and demand answers from those in power.
Well, this has been a pretty intense start to our deep dive into the world of Pegasus. It's been sobering, but also super important. And before we wrap up part one, I want to touch on another case that I found particularly impactful, the case of Loujain al-Hathwal.
The Saudi women's rights activist.
Yeah, she was abducted from the UAE and taken back to Saudi Arabia.
Her story is incredibly brave, but sadly highlights the risks that activists face when they challenge these authoritarian regimes.
It's believed that her phone was infected with Pegasus, and that the information that was gathered was used to track her movements, which ultimately led to her being detained. She was imprisoned for over 900 days and was subjected to torture. Beatings, electric shocks, waterboarding. It's awful.
That's just horrible. It really highlights how spyware can have these really serious real-world consequences, leading to suffering and injustice.
It underscores the urgent need for greater transparency and accountability in how this technology is used. The NSO Group says that Pegasus has saved tens of thousands of lives, but
at what cost?
Right. How many innocent people have had their privacy violated, their lives disrupted, or worse, in the pursuit of those supposed successes?
It's a chilling thought, for sure.
It really gets to the heart of this ethical dilemma, doesn't it? Can we justify sacrificing the privacy and security of many to potentially protect a few?
That's a really tough question, and there are no easy answers. But it's something that we as a society have to deal with as we navigate this increasingly complicated digital world. So we've been talking about the scary capabilities of Pegasus spyware and how it can turn your phone into a surveillance device without you even realizing it. And we've already touched on some pretty disturbing cases.
Right. Cases like Jamal Khashoggi and Loujain al-Hathwal, they really show the devastating impact this technology can have. But let's dig a little deeper into some specific instances of how Pegasus has actually been used against people.
One case that really stands out is the group of activists and researchers in Mexico who were campaigning for a soda tax, to fight childhood obesity.
They were spied on because of their work promoting public health. It seems a little extreme.
Yeah, it does. But it highlights how easily this technology can be misused. Apparently, some folks in the Mexican government were not happy about their campaign.
So the government used this military-grade spyware to silence people who are advocating for better health. What other examples are there?
Unfortunately, it's not an isolated incident. There are tons of reports of journalists, activists, even human rights lawyers being targeted with Pegasus just in Mexico alone.
It seems like anyone who challenges the status quo in Mexico is at risk of being spied on. How do they even get people to install this spyware?
Remember those text messages that Ahmed Mansour received? The ones that promised to reveal secrets about torture in UAE prisons?
Right. Thankfully, he was suspicious, and that led to Pegasus being exposed.
Well, those messages were just the beginning. The people behind Pegasus had become masters of what's called social engineering.
Social engineering, what's that?
It's basically the art of manipulating people into doing something they wouldn't normally do, like clicking on a bad link or opening an infected attachment.
So like those phishing emails we all get, trying to trick us into giving away our passwords.
Exactly. But the techniques that these Pegasus attackers use are way more sophisticated. They really tailor their messages to their target's interests and weaknesses.
So they could, for example, send a journalist a message pretending to be a source, offering them a huge scoop.
Yep. Or they might send a message to an activist posing as a fellow activist, urging them to click a link to sign a petition or something.
It's really disturbing. You're preying on people's trust and their desire to do good.
And it works.
Yeah.
Even tech-savvy people can fall victim to these scams if they're not incredibly careful.
Let's talk about Javier Valdez, the Mexican journalist who was tragically murdered back in 2017. He was really outspoken in his reporting, exposing government corruption and the links between officials and the drug cartels.
Yeah, his story is a terrible example of the dangers that journalists face when they dare to speak truth to power. According to Citizen Lab, his wife and colleagues were actually targeted with Pegasus in the days following his death.
So they silenced him, and then they continued to spy on the people closest to him. That's just awful.
It really makes you question the Mexican government's commitment to protecting journalists and free speech.
And we've talked about Loujain al-Hathel, the Saudi women's rights activist who was abducted, imprisoned, and tortured. Her phone was also infected with Pegasus.
Yes, and it seems like the information they got from spying on her was used to detain her and justify the horrible treatment she suffered. And these are just a few examples.
It's scary to think that we only know about a tiny fraction of the cases. There could be so many others who've been spied on without knowing.
Absolutely. That's what makes this technology so dangerous. It operates in secret, invisible to the people it's targeting, and it's capable of causing so much damage.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the victims. What about the people responsible? What happens to the governments and the people who misuse this technology?
That's the problem. There's a real lack of accountability when it comes to spyware abuse. The NSO Group claims that they only sell their product to governments for legitimate law enforcement, but they don't seem to want to take any responsibility for how it's actually used.
So they're basically saying guns don't kill people, people kill people.
Right, but the analogy doesn't really work when you're talking about a tool specifically designed for surveillance and espionage. Pegasus is inherently intrusive and has the potential to be used for some really bad things.
And yet there doesn't seem to be much oversight or regulation of its use.
The laws just haven't kept up with how fast technology has advanced. It's like the Wild West out there. Powerful tools are being used with little regard for human rights or democratic principles.
So what can we do? How do we get control of this technology before it's too late?
Well, for starters, we need more transparency. The NSO Group needs to be held accountable for how their product is being used. They need to be open about who they're selling it to and what safeguards are in place to prevent abuse.
Okay, but how do we hold the governments using Pegasus accountable?
That's a more difficult question. International pressure is key. Human rights groups, journalists, concerned citizens. We all need to keep exposing these abuses and demanding justice for the victims.
It sounds like an uphill battle.
It is. But we can't give up. The stakes are too high. The future of privacy, freedom of expression, even democracy itself depends on us being able to control this technology.
It's a daunting thought. But before we get too bogged down in the enormity of the problem, let's shift gears and talk about what individuals can do to protect themselves.
Good point. We need systemic change, but it's also important to empower individuals to take steps to protect their own privacy and security.
So what can our listeners do to reduce their risk of becoming a target?
Awareness is key. The more you know about this technology, how it works, and the tactics that these attackers use, the better you'll be able to protect yourself.
Knowledge is power, as they say. What else can people do?
Be wary of any suspicious messages, especially from senders you don't know. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
It's easy to let your guard down, when you're constantly getting messages and emails.
Exactly. So vigilance is really important. If something even seems slightly off, don't click any links or open any attachments. It's always better to be safe than sorry. And remember, even messages from people you know could be compromised.
So double check everything. What about software updates?
Those are critical. Make sure your devices are running the latest software and install any security updates as soon as they're available.
I have to admit, I sometimes ignore those update notifications.
I get it, they can be annoying. But they're your first line of defense against spyware and other threats. And if you're really concerned about your privacy, think about using a messaging app that has end-to-end encryption.
End-to-end encryption. I'm not familiar with that.
It basically means that only you and the person you're talking to can read your messages. Even the company that makes the messaging app can't see them. It's an extra layer of protection.
Okay, good to know. Any other tips for our listeners?
This might sound a little extreme, but if you're really worried about being targeted, you could try limiting how much personal information you share online.
Be more careful about our digital footprint.
Exactly. The less information you share out there, the less there is for spyware to collect.
It's a tough balance, right? We want to be connected and share our lives online, but we also want to keep our information private.
It's a challenge we all face. The more informed we are about the risks, the better decisions we can make.
That's a great message for our listeners. Be informed, be cautious, and be proactive in protecting your privacy.
I totally agree. But individual actions, while important, they aren't enough. We need to address the bigger problems.
Right. We need to push for stronger laws, greater transparency from companies like the NSO Group, and hold governments accountable for how they use these surveillance tools.
Absolutely. This is a fight for our fundamental rights in the digital age, and it's a fight we can't afford to lose.
So we've spent this deep dive exploring the unsettling world of spyware and the impact it has on individuals and society as a whole.
It's been, well, pretty sobering. We've seen how tech like Pegasus can be used to violate privacy, to silence people who are speaking out, and even to enable violence.
It's been eye-opening, that's for sure, and honestly, a little overwhelming. But is there any hope? Can we fight back against this surveillance and reclaim our digital privacy?
I think so, yeah. I really do. It won't be easy, but I think with the right approach, we can work toward a future where technology is a tool that empowers us, not the other way around.
Okay, I'm ready for some optimism. Where do we even begin?
Well, it all starts with awareness. The more people understand the threat that spyware poses and how it undermines our basic freedoms, the more likely we are to see real change.
So education is key. We need to give people the knowledge to protect themselves.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. When people understand the risks, they can start taking steps to protect themselves and hold the people in power accountable.
Beyond just individual awareness, what other solutions are out there?
Stronger regulations and oversight are critical. We need governments to put laws in place that restrict the sale and use of spyware, especially to regimes that are known for human rights abuses.
But isn't that tricky? Since governments are often the biggest buyers of this technology.
It's true, yeah. It's a classic case of who watches the watchman, but that doesn't mean we should give up. We need to push for international agreements and treaties that limit the spread of spyware and punish those who abuse it.
So global pressure is key.
Absolutely. We need to make it crystal clear that the uncontrolled use of spyware is a threat to democracy and human rights everywhere, not just in the countries where it's currently being abused.
What about the companies themselves, the ones making this technology? What role do they play in all of this?
They have a huge responsibility. They need to make products that are secure and do everything they can to prevent their tech from being exploited for malicious purposes.
We talked about companies like Apple working to patch vulnerabilities, to release security updates. Is that enough?
It's a good start, but they need to do more. Invest in security research, work closely with security experts to find and fix flaws, and just be more transparent about their efforts to fight spyware.
And be more careful about who they sell their products to.
Exactly. They need stricter vetting processes. If they know a government is using this technology to silence dissent or violate human rights, they should refuse to do business with them.
Okay, so we've got education, regulation, corporate responsibility.
Yeah.
What can individuals do to protect themselves in this increasingly surveilled world?
Well, we talked about practical things like being wary of messages that seem suspicious, keeping your devices updated, using secure messaging apps, and being mindful of your digital footprint. But it's more than that. It's also about developing a kind of mindset, a digital self-defense.
Digital self-defense, what does that even mean?
It means being aware of the threats, thinking ahead about your security, and not just assuming that your privacy is protected.
So being informed, being cautious, and taking control of our own security.
Right. It's about saying no to being a passive victim and becoming an active participant in the fight to protect your own privacy.
That's actually pretty empowering. We might not be able to single-handedly take down the entire surveillance system. Right. We can make ourselves harder targets.
Exactly. And when enough people take those steps, it creates a force for change that can't be ignored.
So it's about combining individual action with bigger systemic change.
Yeah.
We need to be vigilant in our own lives and also advocate for greater transparency and accountability from those in power.
Exactly. We need to fight for a future where technology works for us, not against us.
Well said. This has been a real eye-opener, but it's also been inspiring. We've seen the dangers of unchecked surveillance, but we've also seen the hope for a more just and fair digital world.
I agree. And I hope our listeners will join us in this fight.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of spyware. Keep learning, stay informed, and be proactive about protecting your privacy.
Remember, we get to decide what the future of our digital world looks like. It's up to all of us.
That's a great note to end on. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay empowered.